There's something out in the woods, and it's getting closer to my home. First off, let me explain that I'm an older man. I live alone on some land out in some random holler nobody would never care to know about. It's a deep and dark patch of old-growth forest, older than God himself. For many years, we had a farm out here. Ever since my wife passed on, though, I let it sort of fall apart. There's still a few chickens I take care of, but they're easy work. It's very, very quiet and lonely out here. My only neighbors are about 4 or 5 miles up the single dirt road that leads out here, and they're set up even deeper in these woods. On a night where the clouds hang low, I can see the faint glow of their floodlights. Otherwise, they're invisible from elevation changes and, of course, the dense forest. Anyways, I'm not trying to give out too much information about myself because I'm nothing to write home about, but it's important to understand I live beyond nowhere. It'll help to understand this predicament I'm in. I'm no superstitious man. I'm no nutcase trying to find the devil in the shape of a cloud, so don't write me off as one when I share what I'm about to say. The last few nights, I've been hearing something strange out in the forest. I'm not talking about the cries of a fox, the hoots of an owl, or the roar of my distant neighbors' obnoxious ATVs. This is something new, even to me. I've lived out in these woods or those woods my whole life. Weird sounds happen. Sounds that trip something primitive within you and send you into a whirlwind of paranoia, but they always amount to some annoying critter. For the first time in my life, though, I can say with the utmost confidence that this sound isn't coming from any of it, nor is it Bigfoot. It started 3 nights ago. It was well past midnight when I was woken up by these odd noises that sounded like giant strips of Velcro being ripped off somewhere in the woods. Sounds tend to reverberate through this valley I'm in, so I couldn't get a good gauge of how far away it was. It sounded so bizarre that at first I thought I was still asleep or having some sort of auditory hallucination. As the rips persisted, however, I realized this was no fiction of my mind. I had the thought that maybe I wasn't hearing the full spectrum of the sound inside the house, so I went out on the deck to try and get a better understanding of whatever the hell it was. There was no new quality to the sound outside, except that it was more clear. I sat out there and listened for a few minutes. It never stopped. Ripping and more ripping. I stared into the black expanse for minutes more, my eyes slowly adjusting enough to make out vague details of faraway trees. Atop a nearby hill, a couple miles off and in between my neighbors and me, I was able to see trees swaying unnaturally. There wasn't any wind that night. The swaying trees moved independently of those next to it, which stood perfectly still. The ripping sound was coming from those swaying trees. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, and I'm certainly not stupid enough to wander out into the night with my bum knees and crooked back. I went back inside. The ripping persisted for another hour or so, and it was so consistent that eventually my ears grew accustomed to the odd racket. Sleep is hard to come by for me these days, so I never went back to bed. Instead, I did some chores and watched some TV, trying to take my mind off of that noise. I must admit, it definitely got to me. Living out in the middle of nowhere my whole life, it isn't easy to scare me. The foreign nature of this sound, though, the swaying trees and accompaniment, it sparked some fear. Whoever was out there was using a lot of power to sway those trees the way they were moving, and the fact I could hear those ripping sounds from a respectable distance spoke to how loud they must have been. Were they using some kind of machinery? It must have been some sort of construction, but why at that ungodly hour? And why was the supposed site not being lit? Maybe something illegal. I really don't know. I've been around all sorts of contraptions and equipment. None of them came close to resembling that stretching, ripping, sticking sound. I don't know. If I'm being truthful with myself and speaking from the gut, the sound didn't indicate anything man-made or animal that I'd ever heard. But of course, it's probably just something new I haven't heard of. The daytime offered a grace period to recuperate my mind and settle myself down. The sun shining on you always inspires logical reassurance. But then came the second night. The noise started at a similar time. This time, I was mostly already awake from my crowded midnight mind. I was tossing and turning, paranoid, anxiously fearing, but at the same time awaiting that sound to return. Sadly, it did. It was the same sound, no closer and no farther. I waited in bed, hoping it would stop quickly, but it carried on and on and on. I went and sat out on the deck and I began to study the noise. It was so consistent that I was able to break the sound down into sections to try and better understand what I was hearing. The first, or what I perceived as the first sound, was a quieter, thudding kind of noise. Then a stretching or tearing sound, which followed quickly after the thud. Imagine the sound of duct tape being pulled, but much, much louder and lower. This was what I originally characterized the entire noise as, but there was more to it upon listening closer. A few seconds after the tearing was a third noise, which sounded like something being plucked, like a rubber band or a string being plucked, but once again, louder and lower than that. Afterwards, a very low and bassy reverberation throughout the valley that at times buzzed the glass on my house and even rumbled in my chest. That was the sound broken into parts, and it would repeat back, starting on the thud every 5 to 10 seconds. That was the strange part. It was inconsistent, implying all of this was being done manually by something out there. Underneath those strange successions of noises was a seemingly random series of low tapping sounds like little rumbles of thunder. The sound made my skin crawl all over again after truly appreciating the complexity of it. Once again, the sound lasted somewhere in the 1 to 2 hour duration. I was too transfixed to check times. When I wasn't carefully listening, I was locking my eyes on the near invisible trees which swayed to the sounds yet again. I couldn't be certain, but it seemed to be the same trees that were moving the night before. The remainder of the night felt claustrophobic, like the darkness outside was an all-encompassing blanket which smothered me. I felt trapped with my frantic thoughts and whatever was making that noise out there. I laid awake the whole night, watching the sky slowly turn from pitch black to a sheet of midnight blue, and from there an ever more inviting shade of blue which, after what felt like untold eons of agony, eventually brought in the brilliant oranges and reds of the rising sun. Daybreak at last. The comfort of trustworthy light and the sounds of other, more comprehensible animals outside soothed me to a merciful sleep where I could dream about gentler things like my best friend and her wonderful smile. I woke up sometime around noon to a sound I recognized for a change, but nonetheless wasn't fond of. It was the sound of a dying animal. Something was yipping and yelping out in the acres of tall grass I used to take care of. I struggled up and wobbled out onto the deck and strained my eyes for this new target. I saw something limping or dragging through the tall grass, and it appeared to have just exited the forest. It looked like it was limping away from the hilltop where the sounds in the night came from. A logical fallacy, I know, but my mind was and still is desperate for any sort of conclusions. I watched the animal, which now looked to be a deer, struggle across my field until about halfway between the tree line and my home, the poor thing collapsed. I felt an urge to go and get a closer look despite the uneven terrain and high chances of snakes, ticks, and other pests looking for something to bite. I grabbed my cane and wobbled my way to the fresh carcass. The grass wasn't easy to navigate through, and if I hadn't already made a mental note of the surrounding trees, I doubt I would have been able to find the animal in the denseness of it all. The slight slope made my pathetic knees crack and my back begged me to turn around. Finally, I came across the animal, which was actually still gasping its last gasp as I arrived. Blood gurgled from its mouth, and the deer's beady eyes looked nowhere before finally stiffening up and accepting death. The deer's bottom half was mauled, skin dangling along with all sorts of innards that shouldn't be seen. The injuries were not encouraging, as they were nothing I had ever seen before. Gored animals are not too uncommon out in the sticks, but the wound looked strange. I couldn't for the life of me find any sort of bite marks or even scratch marks on the deer. No signs of a skirmish. The more I looked at the mess, the more it looked like the deer had been eviscerated by one single blow. But this singular blow would have had to have been delivered by something huge. The giant gash looked as if a telephone pole grew legs in a thirst for blood and impaled this poor deer. A hole punched paper in a binder that was ripped off the ring. The hind legs were mostly ripped away, with only the tops of the femurs still attached, one hanging by a piece of random cartilage. The deer was effectively ripped in half, yet somehow must have been so petrified that it possessed enough adrenaline to drag itself an impressive distance. Maybe I read too much into it, trying to piece together something too fast. That deer could have been chewed on for hours by any sort of predator. But how had it remained alive and then left alone to retreat so far away? It didn't make sense, at least not to me. I followed the trail of blood the deer had left behind to the horizon, and of course it looked to be a straight line to the troublesome group of swaying trees from the nights prior. It was going to be hard to convince me the deer was unrelated to those strange sounds, and it still has me convinced as I write this. I wish I had the mobility to follow that blood trail to its inception, but I just don't anymore. Maybe my handicap saved me a similar fate, though. The rest of that day was spent tending to the chickens and watching TV. I didn't have an appetite, so all I had was some tea at supper time. I was filled with the deepest sense of dread as the sun dipped below the mountains, watching the brilliant oranges recede back into the cold midnight blue. On the third night, last night, I was once again awoken by the thud, tear, pluck, and rumble of the mysterious thing out there. It sounded the same as it did the last 2 nights. Something in the trees was working away, building something, destroying something, hole-punching more deer, and it was nauseating to think of something so foreign that was so close to me and making itself at home. Sleep wasn't on the table, so I went out on the deck again. I sat out there, listening and watching. The same trees were swaying in unison with the strange noises. The clouds were hanging low last night, and I was almost delighted to see the faint glow of my faraway neighbor's floodlights on the underbelly of the giant sheet of clouds. I wonder if they can hear all this too, I thought to myself in an endless cycle. Even if it was just a mere reflection of other people far off, it was a welcome sign of relief for me. I got to listening to the sounds again, this time analyzing every part with as much attention as I could. The tearing was certainly the loudest, most gripping part. However, perhaps the best representation of this thing were the smaller sounds. For instance, the quieter tapping noises. What were those? They were totally random, with no predictable sequence. Chewing? I hoped not. That wouldn't make sense. It's still too loud for something like that. There was a lot of bassiness to the taps, like they were on the ground or on something that resonated a lot. Chewing also wouldn't be so constant and so fast. These little taps were continuously underneath the tearing noises, like something supportive, some unknown kind of rhythm. Even though my gut was stuck in the otherworldly, the superstitious virus that infects us all, my brain was still looking for something tangible. Machinery was the leading theory on that front, some kind of operation out there run in the dark by questionable strangers. But now, with the deer carcass and the almost organic nature of the sounds, even my brain was beginning to believe this sound was caused by something living. The little thunderous taps underneath every other sound, the swaying in the trees, the time of night it occurred, something nocturnal, something with eyes and ears that moves around, something that hunts or kills if provoked. The little taps moving around in random beats, like the footsteps of a crowd. Legs. As if my thoughts had been perceived by the thing in the woods, one of the swaying trees snapped and suffered some structural injury, bringing the canopy down enough for me to observe it from the deck, followed soon after by a loud booming rumble which shook the surroundings, if only a tiny, nearly imperceptible amount. The boom scared me so much, I tensed up and threw my back out, sending me into agonizing pain. As I sat there, uselessly gripping my back and gritting my teeth, I heard new sounds that seemed closer. I looked up into the dark woods as I heard something massive skittering on the forest floor. I then heard trees snapping and heaps of leaves thrashing as if this thing was switching between ground and treetop effortlessly. I tracked the movement, starting from the hilltop as it quickly covered ground, heading left into flatter terrain, into the valley that I lived in. I had no course of action in mind beyond observing. What could be done at that moment? I was frozen from pain and fear. Luckily, this thing didn't reveal itself to me last night, and wherever it may have retreated, it had gone silent for the remainder. Now, however, it's much closer to me. And that must be where it is now, because I've stayed out on the deck listening closely for most of the time since this happened last night or this morning, whatever. Maybe I'm just descending into madness. The isolated nature of my life and my declining health, maybe it's the perfect ingredients to send me into a paranoid delirium. But maybe not. I haven't been able to consult with anyone on this. It's just me out here. Well, me and my neighbors. And after whatever the hell happened last night, I'm beginning to think nothing around here is safe. Staring into the friendly glow of their lights last night got me thinking a lot about them. I can't in good conscience continue on like everything is fine. I need to go up there and at least make some small talk and try to insert a breadcrumb of what's been happening out here. Maybe they can help ease my mind about all this. Later today, I'll take my truck up to their place. They aren't the most neighborly, but it just has to be done. I'll be back on here within the next few days for some kind of update should anything else happen. The internet out here is dreadful, and I'm dreadfully ignorant about how to work it. Be patient. If any of you have anything to offer up as well, I'm all ears. Please, if any of this sounds familiar to you, I'd really appreciate your input. I don't know what to think right now.